In this video, we're going to take a look at a variety of other list methods that you have available to you. And a couple of times now I've shown you that when you type a list name and then a dot and a tab, IPython will show you the complete list of methods that you're allowed to call on that list object. So for this example, or series of examples rather, let's start with a list called color names. And let's also begin by demonstrating various ways to add elements to a list. So to begin, we're going to use the insert method, which, as its name implies, is going to insert an item into the list. And the way it works is you specify the index number where you'd like to place a value, and let's say we want to insert red in this list. The index number is the point at which the new value will be placed. Whatever is already there will be, if you will, shifted to the right in the collection and will now have an index 1 higher than that. So at index 0 right now is orange. It's now going to be index 1 in the updated list. So if I go ahead and display color names after that operation, we can see index 0 is now red and index 1 is now orange. Now, another way to add one item to a list is with the append method, and as its name implies, it's going to add that to the end of the list. So if I go ahead and say I want to add the object blue to the end of the list, I can then re-evaluate color names, and now we see that the append operation did indeed place an item at the end of the list. Now, both of these methods insert one object into the list. In the first case, wherever you want. In the second case, only at the end. Separately, you have the ability to add a whole bunch of items to the end of a list, and there's a couple of ways to do that, one of which is the extend method. So actually for this one, let me copy and paste a snippet of code to execute. So here what we have is our list color names, the extend method that we'd like to call, and the argument to this method is a sequence of objects that you would like to add to the end of the list. And what will happen in this case is each individual item within that sequence will be placed at the end of the list color names. So if I go ahead and execute that and then once again reevaluate color names, you can see that both indigo and violet were added to the end of the list. I did not take the entire list object and add that as one item into the list. It actually iterates through the elements, taking one item at a time from the sequence argument and adding them to the end. Now, this is actually the equivalent of using the plus equals operator. Let's go ahead and look at this extend method in a little bit more detail. Let's start with a list that's empty, for example, and let's demonstrate what happens when you extend a list with a string. So let's say we have a string that's just ABC for demonstration purposes here, and we want to add them to the end of the sample list, so we'll use the extend method once again, and we'll give it the sequence S as an argument, so we can see what the sample list looks like after that operation, and you see that it picks off each individual entity within the sequence that you pass as an argument. And the same thing would be true, by the way, with a tuple. So if I have a tuple called T and I give it a few values, and then I say to sample list to extend with T as an argument, it's going to pick off the 1, the 2, and the 3 and add them to the end of the sample list. So you have one list with 3 elements that came from the string and 3 elements that came from that tuple. Now, in each of these two cases, we took a variable that represented a sequence and passed it into the extend method. What if you just wanted to pass a tuple directly to the extend method? So let's say we want to call sample list, and I'm not going to execute this yet, but let's just type it first. So let's say I want to add 4, 5, and 6. Whoops, I forgot the extend call. So let's say we want to add 4, 5, and 6 to the end of sample list. You might be tempted to write the expression this way, but the extend method requires one argument only, and that argument must be a sequence of values. So if you accidentally pass in more than one element, which is what I'm doing here, you would actually get a type error if you were to execute this code. So again, it expects one object to be passed as an argument. So if you want to pass a tuple of values into the extend method, you would have to actually wrap them in an additional set of parentheses. So now what we have here inside the parentheses is actually a tuple containing 4, 5, and 6. We're passing one object to the extend method, a tuple. It's then iterating through the tuple to evaluate the elements, and we can see that we were able to add 4, 5, and 6 to the end of the list. So at this point, we've shown you that you can insert and append items to a list. Now let's talk about removing items from a list. So for example, if we go ahead and if we say color names dot remove, and let's say we want to remove the string green. So we're talking about the color names list up above here once again, and you can see the string green is in there. So we have this remove method for that purpose, and it's going to remove the very first item it encounters that has that value. And of course we only have one such item in this particular case. And now if we evaluate color names after that remove operation, indeed green is gone. Now this operation also will result in a value error if the specified argument is not found within the list. So you do want to be aware of that issue. Now you can also completely empty out a list. We demonstrated a way to do that using slicing in a preceding video, but there's also the clear method. So I can say color names.clear, and if I then evaluate color names after that operation, you can see there's no elements left in the list. And that would have been the equivalent of saying color names sub colon sub, so just an empty set of square brackets with a colon in the middle, and we could have assigned to that the empty list, and that's the equivalent of calling clear. And in this case they happen to take up the same number of characters, so there you can really choose either way and use the one that's your preference. Okay, so we've looked at a number of different methods so far. Next, what we'd like to do is talk about counting up the number of occurrences of a given item within a list. So for this purpose, I'm going to paste in a responses list that has a whole bunch of numeric values from 1 through 5 in it, and these might be responses to a survey, for example. And then what we want to do is just total up those responses. So I'm going to use a little for loop for that purpose, and I'll paste it in and then explain it to you. So here we have a for loop where the target variable I is going to be a value from 1 through 5. Those happen to be the values in my responses list. And for every one of those items, we're going to say the item, whatever I is at this point, appears, and then we're going to figure out how many times it appears in the responses list. So responses.count is the key part of this print statement. Responses.count with the argument I says count up how many times the value I appears in that list, and for each of those items we can see how many times each of those occur. And of course you can go back and count them up yourself to confirm that these count values are in fact correct. Now count, by the way, was one of those descriptive statistics that we introduced in an earlier lesson as well. So if you had a list full of a large number of items and you were trying to do a little bit of descriptive statistics on the list, one of the things you might do is something like this for loop here. Now, a couple more items that we have for lists. We also have the ability to reverse a list's elements. So let's start by redefining our color names list here, and I'm mainly doing this so that we can see it close to the snippet of code that I'm about to execute. So we can see the order of the strings at the moment. If I go and say color names dot reverse, that's going to reverse the items in the list in place. It's modifying the list. So if I do that and then evaluate color names, you can see indeed they have been reversed inside that list. So that's a convenient way to quickly reverse the items in a collection, in a list specifically. And then finally, there's one other method that we want to point out in this video, the method copy. So let's create a copied list variable for a moment. If I say color names.copy, this is going to perform a shallow copy of the color names list. What that means is I will get another list with the same number of elements as color names, and the elements will refer to the same objects that color names refers to. So blue, green, yellow, orange, and red as strings will exist in memory, and both the color names list and the copied list are going to refer to the same elements. So if I now go and say copied list, you can see we have what appears to be a copy of the original list. And remember, you can always go and use that ID function to confirm that we really do have the same object. So for example, if I go and say ID of color names sub 0, we can see what the ID number is for that. And if I repeat that for the copied list at element 0, we can see we get the exact same ID value, which is further confirmation that both of these lists have elements referring to the same objects in memory.